All right, I think we're going to get started. So have a seat if you're staying. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I'm Robert Trager, Director of the AI Governance Initiative here at the Martin School at the University of Oxford. And we have really an extraordinary panel today. Some of the people really on the front lines of AI governance in the world today from a range of perspectives. So it should be an interesting discussion. We stand right now at a moment when there are many calls for international governance, highlighting the great need for international governance. And there are indeed many efforts to do so in the world today, but it is a fractured landscape. So how can all these different initiatives fit together? What new initiatives do we need? What existing initiatives can we build upon? Those are some of the questions that we're going to get to today. We've had the conclusion of the UN's high-level advisory body report and the adoption of the Global Digital Compact at the Summit of the Future in New York this fall. We have G7 processes and closely related OECD processes, and now GPAI, the Global Partnership on AI, also joining as that organization merges with the OECD. We have the ongoing AI Summit series that began here in the UK at Bletchley Park. We have the recent convening of AI safety institutes in San Francisco. We have the ongoing concretization of the EU AI Act, for instance, in the Code of Practice that is currently being written. So it is indeed a crowded landscape. Happily, we have this extraordinary panel to make sense of it all, in particular the allure and limits of the global governance of AI. So I'll introduce our speaker today, who will give a bit of a talk, and then we will have a moderated panel and get to your questions. So it is my pleasure to introduce Juraj Čorba. He is the chair of the convening of countries at the OECD addressing AI governance, known as the OECD Working Group on AI Governance, or AIGO. He's also a senior expert in the Slovak Ministry of Investments, Regional Development, and Informatization, responsible for digital regulation and governance. He led negotiations on behalf of Slovakia in the EU's AI Act at the Council of the EU, that is to say, the Council of Ministers, and on the first International Convention on AI, the Convention on Artificial Intelligence, Human Rights, Democracy, and the Rule of Law at the Council of Europe. He is, by the way, also the author of the script for an experimental graphic novel on the professional and moral challenges of using AI. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Juraj Čorba.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished members of the panel, dear Robert. First of all, I would like to express my sincere gratitude for the opportunity to be here today with you at this extraordinary time. Robert has already described the challenges we are facing in what we could call policing the AI space. It's really extraordinary times, and it is my great honor to be here today. And I would like to thank Robert especially and his team for inviting me to the Oxford University premises. We are having this UK tour now these days. We continue tomorrow at Cambridge University and we'll end at Alan Turing Institute in London on Friday. Each and every session has a different topic. So this session is indeed unique, and I'm very, very happy that we can meet today. It is actually very interesting to think about what are we actually discussing when we discuss AI governance. We spend long months of discussions at the OECD with hundreds of experts when we try to actually update our definition of artificial intelligence over the past year. It was extremely interesting to see how different people understand what the artificial intelligence actually is to them. So it's not only about actually the question of what AI is, but also when we look at the governance of AI and the global efforts, we need to see that actually at the end of the day, we have multiple frameworks at play. We can think of governance of investments, governance of research and development, governance of machinery or hardware and devices, related cloud and edge solutions. We can speak about governance of data supply, including data mining, data access, trade, protection, etc., etc. We can think of a governance of models and algorithms, or even of systems, governance of service, product design, sales, governance of platforms, all these different components, and I could continue, they somehow relate or are actually or form integral part of what we call AI governance. Yet, of course, we need to focus ourselves on the actual governance of AI, what it is. We try to provide a definition at the OECD. You can find the updated definition, which then inspired the definition in the first international treaty on AI, which was already mentioned, also inspired the EU AI Act and many other frameworks around the world. And you can consider whether we were successful or not in that, of course. But yes, indeed, beyond all these partial frameworks, we actually speak about human abstraction powered by machines. That's what the core of AI governance probably means. Now, we are facing the challenge or the question whether we are actually able to build these days something like a global framework, global AI governance framework. What is extremely interesting and also challenging, of course, is the fact that we are having now these aspirations for global governance of AI at times of a weakening post-war global architecture, including, arguably, a weakening role of arbitrators on the international scene. Many of you may have seen some of the reports on the difficulties the European Court of Human Rights is facing when we are trying to enforce its decisions in the member states of the Council of Europe. Many of you can see the discussions around the judgments of the International Court of the United Nations, or now, lately, International Criminal Court, etc., etc. Of course, these courts are not necessarily all relevant for AI, but it seems that the consensus and the general respect we used to have for these institutions is not necessarily dissipating, but certainly we are seeing signs that are not really encouraging. Yet, on the other side, if we turn to the domestic scenes, there we see some aspirational moves by the domestic courts. I will return to that later in my speech. But this is an interesting paradox. So it seems that the domestic scene is really getting more and more visible, and we have some first signals from the judges on the domestic level. Now, in the past, the humankind has successfully created certain tools for governance of horizontal interactions between people, mainly defined by physical space, such as principles of conflicts of laws that were developed, or legal fictions such as the Westphalian notion of state entity. We have even managed as humans to create workable frameworks of governance of symbolic interfaces that govern our relation to the world as we see it. We succeeded in creating fairly complex governance structures for money and global finance. Now, it seems the complexity is even larger. It's not only about horizontal interactions in easily defined spaces, but rather we are getting into vertical phenomena where we have multiple structures, infrastructures, and we deal with modeling and representation of reality. And this is becoming, for us, quite hard to monitor, even to grasp. The good news, though, is that in reality, over the history, the governance as such has always been an aspiration. In other words, we always have this ideal of controlling and ruling what is happening in our societies. Yet, of course, we know that this is more of an aspiration and that not everything always goes as envisaged. And this is what actually makes history. What is perhaps novel is that we are trying to govern a very sophisticated, almost invisible technique or discipline that increases potentially significantly the ability of relevant actors to govern others, be it public entities, states, etc., our governments, or private entities that sell products and offer services to us. So we are actually trying to govern the means of government with a possibly significantly increased capabilities. On the global level, as was already mentioned by Robert, we have witnessed these efforts to arrive at some kind of a common global consensus when we negotiated the UN Digital Compact. Now, this was adopted, as we all know, this September. I personally had the opportunity to participate also in these negotiations on behalf of my country. And what is extremely interesting is the fact that one of the few issues on which the global community was able to find a consensus was to create something like a scientific panel that should address all the risks, all the opportunities, the ways how we can mitigate the risks, and the ways how we can harness the opportunities on the basis of scientific knowledge. Now, of course, I also presume this was inspired by the International Panel on Climate Change, which even has a similar name. The big question that we may face there is that although we seem to be relying on science, just like in the case of climate, the big question is AI actually of the same quality as climate change? In other words, how scientific, in the proper meaning of the word, can we actually get at the global level? What we normally see when we speak about AI governance are usually the technical aspects, the different criteria we expect to be, or different benchmarks to be followed by the models and systems, such as accuracy, robustness, security, etc., etc. And we think about these models and systems. Yet, arguably, just like with the other types of human interface, such as languages, alphabets, money, etc., which enable us to create unusual abstractions and use them for our benefit. Here, when we speak of AI, I personally believe we cannot simply lose the sight of the human factor, which can be at least as important as the technical aspects. So the behavioral side of the equation brings us into questions such as, what are the implicit assumptions of people building the models and systems? What are the explicit assumptions? How we can test them? How people will interpret and react to different outputs that the models or systems will offer us on the go as we use them. This is, of course, a major challenge, as we know that humans are mysterious beings, and we can always surprise, which is good, I would say. Yet, we are also aware of the discussions about the limits of social science, of proper knowledge of, behavioral economy, for instance, big discussion out there, right? What is important for us and the formation that I have the honor to chair is that it is actually the OECD and the Global Partnership on AI, which has been recently embedded into the OECD. It is us who are supposed to provide, under the UN Digital Compact, the knowledge to this scientific panel. It is explicitly there, also in the UN Advisory Board report that inspired the UN Digital Compact. And we can also find it in the UN Digital Compact as such that it is actually us, of course, and other international platforms that are supposed to feed in the so-called scientific knowledge, on the basis of which we will have global policy dialogues, and on the basis of which we could possibly achieve some kind of a global consensus on the governance of AI. Big challenge there. Now, the final thought I would like to share with you, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion in the panel, is the fact that these global governance aspirations, such as the UN Digital Compact, are by definition aimed mainly at the executive and parliamentary branches of our governments. And now I return to the topic of the judiciary. We seem to be forgetting that we have this important branch of government, in many countries, independent branch. And the key question is, how will the judiciary, be it on a domestic or international level, respond to this big challenge? How will the judges decide when they will handle individual cases? How will they be able to actually grasp the dynamics of the cyberspace powered by AI? So definitely when we discuss the AI governance framework, we should always think about those people who will apply the rules that we may be able to create to individual circumstances. And we need to make sure that these people properly understand both the technical side and the legal side, and of course with the all best possible knowledge that we can provide them with. I would stop by mentioning one concrete case that I'm familiar with, and this is a case coming from a domestic level, to the extent we can consider the European Union a domestic level within the wider international arena of international affairs and relations. If you look at some of the recent judgments of the Court of Justice of the EU over the past 2-3 years, it seems that we will be facing significant difficulties in translating the expectations of the judges into practical software or other solutions. Concretely, first of all, there was a case related to the protection of copyright, the so-called copyright directive under the EU law. Details are not really important now, where the judges came to the conclusion that, yes, indeed, the platforms, in order to be able to control the legality and the copyright protection of works distributed on the online platforms, yes, the platforms need to use machines and automated means, including, of course, artificial intelligence, in order to be able to identify the problematic content and then possibly to remove it. Yet, in the second part of the judgment, there comes the threshold, the requirements for the AI systems to be used. And the judges simply say that these systems need to be as reliable or so reliable to be able to distinguish without any major complications what is legal and what is illegal under the copyright law. Now, of course, the first question we may have, do we have such systems available? And if not, what it means? And how are then the compliance departments and everyone, including the authors, how are we to apply this? Another case was a Schufa case decided last December at the Court of Justice of the EU, where this was a case related to a situation where a bank outsourced assessment of creditworthiness to a third party, to a company, which provided by automated means with the help of artificial intelligence these assessments of clients who applied for loans. Without going into the details, what comes out of the judgment is a clear signal from the judges that, notwithstanding any codes of practice previously being even approved by relevant supervisory authorities, notwithstanding what was approved in these codes of practice, the judges hold the last word on what is acceptable and what is not, and whether the rights have been infringed or not. Last but not least, the case at the Court of Justice which related to risk assessment of passengers flying in. As we fly, we are being analyzed and profiled these days. The Court of Justice basically came to a conclusion that if the public authorities doing the risk assessments use machine learning and artificial intelligence, and those results cannot be properly explained, this is simply not acceptable, because the reviewing judge, under the right to an effective judicial review, will not be able to examine why the government has identified a certain person as a risk or not to the national or public security. So it seems that despite all our grand schemes and policy efforts among the policymakers, different disciplines, experts, it is the end of the road which may be crucial in a way, or for the way that we are able to actually govern AI and harness its benefits, yet address the risks. Are the judges ready? Are we all ready to support these institutions, given the speed, the new volumes in the cyberspace? How are we going to cope with this? With these words, I would like to thank again for the opportunity to speak, and I'm looking forward very much to discussing some of the issues still in the panel. Thank you very much.
Right. Thank you so much. I'd like to invite our panel up to the stage, please, and I'll introduce them briefly because we have a lot to talk about. So maybe I'll introduce them in order over here, starting with Henry. In fact, we have two senior advisors to the AI governance initiative here, Henry Zoete and Sam Daws. So Henry over here, former AI advisor at Number 10, among many other significant government and private sector roles. He is, for instance, one of the primary people responsible for the AI Summit series mentioned earlier. So those of you who don't like it, here he is. No. We have Marta Ziosi, who is a postdoc at the AI Governance Initiative and also the vice chair of the EU General Purpose AI Code of Practice, and Sam Daws, who has worked in multilateral diplomacy for many decades, including as first officer to Kofi Annan when he was the UN Secretary General and as a senior advisor in the UK Cabinet Office. So we have a really interesting panel. Thank you to all of them for joining us. I think maybe I'll start with Sam to ask about the UN and the role of the UN here in this broad governance landscape. So are there things within the AI governance landscape, needs that you think can be very well addressed by the UN? How do you see the UN fitting into everything else that's happening?
Thanks, Robert, and lovely to be here, and really appreciated your initial remarks. Thank you. When we say the UN, there are really three UNs: the UN of member states that set the mandates and provide the resources, the UN of the International Civil Service, headed by the UN Secretary General, and the partners of the UN, from business to NGOs to trade unions, that help deliver their goals. So depending on which UN we're talking about, there's different things that it can and can't do. I think one thing's clear from the negotiations and the lead up to the Summit of the Future is that there's no willingness among member states for the UN to play an enforcement role on AI safety or security, and on the lines of the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency. Also, if we look at the history of the UN's engagement with the private sector, we can say that the UN is unlikely to play a role in regulation. The UN generally takes a light touch approach to the private sector, but can play a key convening role, bringing together multi-stakeholder actors, including the private sector. And I think what it also can't do is shape AI to ensure that it benefits the public good, particularly bridging the digital divide. It can convene and encourage to do that, but it doesn't have a really effective carrots and sticks to ensure that that actually happens. So a few examples of what it can constructively do. We see lots of clues in the Summit of the Future, Global Digital Compact Outcome, and the HLAB. One is to provide moral leadership. Antonio Guterres is the first Secretary General with a science and technology background. And I think it's one of the reasons he's set about processes which led to the Summit of the Future in the GDC and HLAB. I think it will be important to see what happens in a couple of years' time when we have the next Secretary General, whether she also sees AI as a priority. I think it's likely that she will, and that will mean that when we review the Sustainable Development Goals, the UN can play a key role in ensuring that the achievement of whatever replaces that framework from 2030 onwards is infused with the capabilities of AI. Just a couple of other examples, and then I'll stop there. The UN has a role in setting high-level principles. We saw that with UNESCO and the great work of the OECD, from transparency, accountability, having human in the loop, sustainability, and so on. But main governance, I think, is still going to be at a national and regional level. It can potentially have a modest role in dialogue around mitigating the peace and security dimensions of AI. I think that's likely to happen through existing mechanisms like the Security Council and the Vienna and Geneva-based kind of crime, terrorism, disarmament, non-proliferation agencies. And as we've heard from Juraj, convening scientists and building trust in their findings, I think will be a significant contribution the UN can make. But it's going to be a lot more difficult, as you said, than an IPCC or an IPBES. And part of the reason for that is that AI is a general purpose technology. If you think the objective on climate change is very clear, 1 ton of carbon anywhere in the world either is part of the problem or taking it out as part of the solution. But AI is so diverse that when we're looking at a scientific approach to it, an international scientific approach, as soon as you get into the specifics of what you're trying to address, geopolitics, geoeconomics, divisions at different priorities of countries come into the frame. So what succeeded with IPBES and IPCC is that scientists report neutrally through the independent international panel, and then you have a hybrid process by which member states agree with scientists as a policy summary. And I think that's where the real fight will be, whatever scientific committee that the UN that emerges from the UN process. My final remark on that would be a point that you made, Juraj, which is that science is not just technologists or natural scientists. The International Science Council, the global body that leads on interfacing between scientists and the UN, a couple of years ago embraced the leading social sciences organization globally. And I think what we're seeing, particularly with AI, is that it's the psychologists, the behavioral economists, and the anthropologists, social scientists more generally, that have to be equal partners in the conversation. And the real kind of advice that will move the dial on the policy aspects of AI, I think will come equally from the social scientists as well as the natural scientists. So that convergence, that interdisciplinary dimension, I think will be very important.
Thank you, Sam. I'm going to turn to Marta to ask about the code of practice process. As was mentioned, Marta is steeped in the writing of the code of practice at the moment. And I think, not just from the point of view of Europe, but from the point of view of the world, this is one of the very interesting things that is happening now in the AI governance space. And as with other European law of the past, has the potential to be very influential internationally. And so I'd like to ask you sort of, I know you're in the midst of it now, but nevertheless, if you can abstract from being in the midst and think about the future, sort of what are the hopes, what are the realistic ideas for where this EU process can go, and what role it can play in the international landscape?
Thanks so much for that question. Very difficult one and complex, but also I think very timely. First of all, thanks so much everyone for being here. Thanks Juraj for your great intervention. And yeah, I assume most of you are aware of what the code of practice is, but just so for those of you who might not be that aware of it, this is sort of like part of the process that got kickstarted, one of the many processes that got kickstarted by the EU AI Act. A part of the EU AI Act, especially dealing with general purpose AI, sort of asked a panel of independent experts to develop the so-called code of practice, which lays out the rules for general purpose AI, but also for general purpose AI with systemic risks. So as you can imagine, this is not an easy task. The timeline is quite tight, because we're expected to have something out by May, which is very soon, and we're trying to integrate as much input as we can from multiple stakeholders. A couple of things to Robert's question. My hopes for it. First of all, I mean, the AI Act is known for its, or hoped to have, let's say, a Brussels effect, right? This has been talked about a lot with the GDPR, and this is a good thing on one hand, but also not necessarily always a good thing. Like, Europe is often seen as sort of like going its own way, and often this can create tensions among the different international frameworks that are arising. So my hope for the COP is sort of that it first is alignment, let's say, sort of brings a European component to it in terms of like important ethical values that we want to see embedded in these systems, but at the same time brings these values with alignment with international frameworks that are arising. That's a very big hope that I have. And I think at the moment that hope is sort of backed by the fact that we have tried as much as possible to sort of have reflected in those COP existing frameworks that have been put out by different stakeholders that sort of reflect the current state of the art. So that's a big hope that I hope it stays across the various layers of drafting that we'll go through. Another one that I think is super important for the COP to have is sort of to go from principles to practice. And you might say, well, that was already the case, right? The AI Act is already a form of practice. But beyond that, I think many people, practitioners especially, are really awaiting to have some very clear guidelines down to the bone of the technicalities of it. And right now, the code of practice, after the first drafting stage, is still pretty general, but the very aim of it, which is also embedded in its structure, it's really to get down to the KPI level. And that's, I think, something that's unheard of, and it's going to be very, very tough to get right, especially because, as Juraj was saying, technology is changing so fast. But I think it's crucial that we do that, and we have that ambition to really bring it down to the relevant technicalities and best practices. And lastly, I think my hope for it is that it's representative of a wide range of stakeholders. This is not an easy process. The timelines are very tight, and it's very easy to get caught up mostly in technicalities. And while those are crucial, it's very, very important that we find the best way to integrate civil society's concern, providers' concerns, and also like not just big providers, but also SMEs that have relevant concerns. And that's really something at the heart, I think, of the COP process that I'd really like to see reflected. And I mean, the deadline to send feedback, as Juraj knows too, is Thursday. So we are really like waiting to get as much feedback as possible. And we are under a tight deadline to like integrate that, but we're really doing our best. And that's really something that I think is at the heart of the COP. And to just close the circle, that's also very crucial for alignment. If we want sort of the COP to have European relevance, but also more of international relevance, it's a great importance that most stakeholders' views are considered. So that's sort of some thoughts on it, but it's a working process, and more thoughts will come along the way. Thanks so much, Robert.
Thank you, Marta. Okay, I want to turn to Henry, who, as I've said, is associated with the summit process and has thought a great deal about the role of the summit process in the broader landscape. So I want to mostly turn to that and ask you how you see it fitting in, where you see its future, and what does it add that maybe other processes do not.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you so much for your speech. Just before I get on to that question, I just was very struck by your closing, where you said, "How are we going to cope?" And I'm quite worried about that too. So we chatted all that, but it also particularly I've spent like the last year inside government trying to educate government people about this technology and legislators, and you wouldn't be surprised to learn that base knowledge was quite low. It's going up, and institutions are being built inside the UK government to try and help that. But I'd completely forgotten about the judiciary and the kind of absolute. You're totally right that there is this need to educate them, particularly when that example you gave of them saying, well, if we can't explain the algorithm, that's totally unacceptable. It's like, that is the technology. Like, this is, we don't know how it works, and people can't explain how it works. So we actually need that whole bit of a functioning democracy has to kind of actually rethink maybe how it approaches all of this stuff. So how do we cope? Not very very appropriate and a great question. So thank you so much for setting those out. On the summit series and how it fits in. I mean, I think it's, you know, I mean, we could just I could do a little bit to talk about, you know, what the rationale behind the Bletchley Summit and the Seoul Summit, and then what's happened and why it was done in the first place, and then how I think it kind of fits in, and how I think it's very important that it carries on. I would say that I am biased, but I think that, you know, the Bletchley Summit, the idea was, can we have quite a focused discussion with the people who are building the most powerful AI? So it wasn't, you know, it was not a kind of like, let's get loads of people who are using AI or deploying AI around the table. It was like, no, we're going to focus on the frontier, on the most powerful models, and have that kind of leadership discussing with world leaders, and exactly like, what does that mean for humanity, and what does that mean for the future in this technology that could be incredibly transformative. And so the kind of baseline of like, oh, can we actually all agree that this is something that we all need to think about and work on, was a kind of step one with Bletchley. And I think obviously the other crucial part of it was having the Chinese involvement from the start. And I think this is probably where the summit series kind of stands out, because it is the only place, as Sam said, I think the UN can't really do the kind of governance that might need to be done, depending on what you think needs to happen in the future. But there isn't actually another place that China is kind of like involved from the start, that involves the US and, you know, other key nations. So if that disappears, I think there's like real questions of like, how do you keep the second largest AI superpower in the world at the table in discussions on all of this, which feels like a very important thing to try and work out how to do. So that, I think, is the kind of standout thing about Bletchley. I think also the key thing about the Seoul Summit, which was you know, a little bit later, was having the companies signing these voluntary agreements to do. So that was the first time we had a really global agreement where you had companies from North America, Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, including Chinese companies, agreeing to do something together. And that felt like an important precedent that should try and carry on. And I struggle to see where else it can carry on if it's not through that summit series.
Thanks, Henry. I want to ask now Juraj about something you were talking about in your speech earlier. This role of finding the scientific consensus. It seemed that you put great faith in that as a way forward, as something that could really clarify for many processes what should be done. And you talked about the role of the OECD there, and also the role of the UN. And yet, you know, Sam also mentioned that in the area of, let's say, climate, we sort of have agreement. We have this sort of consensus already on what's good and bad. You know, we're just trying to figure out how bad it is and how to do some good. Or when we think about another UN organization like the International Civil Aviation Organization, you know, keeping planes in the sky, everybody's agreed on that. But I wonder how you see the needs to develop consensus in this space. Is it really a sort of scientific consensus, the sort of thing that we can expect the engineers to do? Or is there still kind of a set of political questions that we don't have consensus on? And can we expect an IPCC-like panel to achieve consensus on those?
Yes, thank you very much, Robert. I asked the question how scientific we can actually get. The UK government deserves the credit for starting evidence-based, very concrete discussion with some of the creators and providers of the frontier models, and trying to frame the discussion into something that we can call scientific or evidence-based approach. Now, if we read the preliminary report commissioned by the UK government, which was produced by Joshua Bengio and a team of other experts nominated by the participating governments, there we have one clear message, two clear messages in the preliminary report. Let's see what will be the final one to be presented at the French summit in February. One message is that for now, as regards these large models, there are not available, we have no available technical solutions how to evaluate these for now. The second message there is that it's clear that the team was careful enough to say that the report is not to provide policymakers with any kind of recommendations and advice. So, yes, we start from quite a difficult position, of course, not only as expert scientists, engineers, but also as policymakers. And even the companies themselves, or other creators and users of these systems and models, they themselves are probably facing significant challenges. How to actually make sure that the models and the systems behave. So I'm really very humble and modest as regards the expectations we can have from this scientific community and as regards the consensus we can have. It will be a step-by-step exercise. Of course, we at the OECD and the Global Partnership on AI, we will do our best to inform the discussions. I'm pretty sure the EU is also trying to grasp it in a way that can help us to move forward. Yet we also need to realize that, as I already mentioned, we are not just discussing technical aspects and technical issues. By definition, by nature, any representation of reality which aspires to actually even change the reality and control the reality, what the AI models are, they involve social and very human aspects. Now, how can we find a consensus on everything human around the globe? It's unlikely, given the varying traditions, even the way we do economy and commerce, the way we govern our societies, the way we understand what culture and expression, human expression means. So there will be differences, of course, but I think it's an extremely exciting quest, I would even say, because it gives us a true mirror into our own capacities, and I would emphasize human capacities, to actually reflect what we have created and how we are now actually able to coexist, hopefully, in a peaceful and meaningful way.
Thanks, Juraj. Yeah, there was this work on large language models being stochastic parrots, and it's meant to be a critique, but I do find myself asking myself, am I a stochastic parrot? I'd like to just open it up if there are any questions. Yes, right here.
Hi, I'm Bart. I'm reading Master of Public Policy. I'm interested in general questions, normative questions of AI, possible like legal personality of AI and similar issues. But thank you for mentioning judiciary, because this is what I've been thinking on for the past couple of days, maybe even weeks. As like my question probably like pertains to how do you imagine some sort of a global consensus on certain interpretations of certain definitions? Because like if we have effectively different working AI systems in the US and the EU based on our rules, they'll be like separate internets. They'll be like separate silos, essentially. and also how to educate the judiciary, because like the US judiciary focuses on practicalities always. The ECJ basically focuses on proportionality. UK loves the reasonable man approach. There is no man on Clapham Omnibus in the case of AI. I mean, like the man on the Clapham Omnibus hasn't seen a mobile phone, let alone the artificial intelligence. So how do you imagine this system sort of being implemented? Because you either can have very strict regulatory approach where you limit the ability of the judiciary to make their own decision, but then for the business, for example, this is a very hard situation where they wouldn't like to enter into that market because of being scared of making some transgressions. One thing I thought about when you were talking, for example, there are special tribunals for the first instance only, because only first instance discovers facts and the later only the law. Here, for example, welfare benefits, when they decide in the UK, you have a judge and a doctor sitting as one panel, because the law recognizes that the judge doesn't have the understanding of medical knowledge that says whether somebody is disabled or not. So in the same sense, we could have a judge and, let's say, an AI expert sitting together in the first instance, discovering the facts of the specific case. How do you imagine that evolving, and like, how could the different systems cooperate with each other? Because I cannot imagine that right now.
Absolutely, absolutely. There's a lot of open questions, of course. Thank you very much, Mark, for the question. Mark, am I right? Good. Bart, apologies. There is an echo here. I apologize. Yes, well, I will give you an example of how the international community actually tried to approach this challenge. And we had these negotiations on the first international treaty on AI at the Council of Europe with the participation of non-European countries, with the diverse legal, judicial, any other traditions that you can think of. Now, we realized that we cannot really go into too much detail, and that we are able to just agree on some key core principles, which to some extent just reiterate the already existing international human rights law or expectations as regards integrity of democratic systems and rule of law as such. So at the end of the day, if you look at the convention, of course, everyone realized that at least in some jurisdictions, this can be potentially interpreted by the judges. For instance, within the Council of Europe, of which the UK is still a member, it is likely that the AI Convention would be taken into account by the judges at the European Court of Human Rights when they interpret the European Convention on Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms. So we ended up with some kind of a learning mechanism on the go. We were able to agree on that the public authorities actually face a higher scrutiny, higher expectations when it comes to lawfulness, justification, etc., etc. Yet for the private sector, it was much, much more complicated. So what we did, and what the value of the convention actually provides, is that there is a mechanism of on-the-go mutual exchange between the countries, where we can turn to each other between the governments, ask for assistance in case we will be facing cross-border situations, which will most likely be a norm in the cyberspace. And then on the go, we would try to analyze how the individual jurisdictions, including the judges or administrative bodies, such as the European Commission, as we have in the EU, or other arbitration bodies we create, handle the challenge. So there is nothing more we could agree on than just have this on-the-go mutual constant exchange and learn from each other. And let's see what we can learn from the process. So there are no readily available solutions. And of course, the big question is how the classical legacy institutions from the systems that we have will cope in the new conditions. And this was already discussed with the platforms. I remember reading one article in Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, the German newspaper, where they announced that finally a case related to some kind of a libel on a platform was finally settled after 11 years. What's the relevance of the judgment? Of course, we can discuss. I'm not saying there is no relevance, but for AI and such a space, exactly. So, and I will now just speculate, and I will end with that. I think for the new environment and the cyberspace we are creating with AI, we might find some other new solutions and inspiration in the already existing cyberspace communities, be it computer games or any other communities deciding on issues together, or referring the issue to be decided by someone who at the moment holds the authority to arbitrate. So maybe we will witness a new type of dispute settlement procedures, compositions of relevant representatives of the societies that will decide on the spot within the speeds and volumes that we have. But this is still in the making.
So I think actually we can't, because we have time. Let's collect these two questions, but very quickly, both of them, and then we'll try to answer.
Thank you so much for a fascinating discussion. I am Dr. Natalia Tkachenko. I am leading an AI assurance program in the Lloyds Banking Group in the city. So the question I have is actually quite a short one, is, in your opinion, which role you think hyperscalers and big tech should play in this newly formed global architecture of AI governance and AI assurance? Thank you.
Hi, my name is Elias Squirrel. I'm an MPP student as well. I hear this phrase a lot of harnessing the benefits and mitigating the risks of AI, which I have written it myself, but I also find it to be a quite frustrating phrase. I'm curious if folks on the panel could articulate a kind of a positive vision of where the governance regime that we're building for AI is trying to take us, or what you think a positive vision for AI should be, kind of if we achieve the things that we want to in governance world.
Wow, that's another easy one. Thank you, Elias. You know, you're right. You're sort of the guest, so maybe I could give you a minute, 30 seconds. Yeah, if you can. Give thoughts on those.
All right, I will just briefly try on your question, and then I'll leave the other question for others. I spoke already a lot. I think maybe the positive vision could be that if we are to admit that governments are responsible for the interface that people use when they interact with others and with reality and environment, if this is one of the core responsibilities of a government as we understand it, just like with money, for instance, then maybe the positive vision could be that we design such a governance that will improve the way people relate to others and to the environment and the planet we have. Of course, this is very abstract, but it's about the way we all model our relationship to others and to the place where we live. And this is, of course, a very crucial interface. Now, how to govern this is, of course, a major question.
Does anybody want to say something about the role of hyperscalers, which is also actually quite a difficult question that I think governments are thinking a lot about right now? So a really interesting one. Maybe what I can say is we have a paper on that. If you look on our website, one of the papers is called Governing Through the Cloud. And I think there's a ton of things that a hyperscaler can do, arguably. Yeah. yeah, it's a technical problem and a legal problem, what we do. So there are a lot of issues. There are a lot of things that maybe we could do if we developed a little bit of technology that looks pretty possible to develop, but we haven't quite developed yet. So yeah, a lot of interesting things. So I want to, did you want to?
Well, I was very quickly going to say on the hyperscalers thing, they have to be massively involved in all of it, because a lot of it doesn't work without them, and they also have the understanding, and they're also outspending everybody. So how you actually then keep them so that they become too powerful is a different question, and I'm not quite sure what it is, but I think it's very, very tricky at the moment not to have them involved. And then very quickly on the positive vision, I'm not 100% sure this is right, or even if it makes any sense, but sometimes when I think about where do we end up, what would be a great place to end up, is kind of it's a kind of on narrow, using AI in a narrow way to solve problems that are big human facing problems, like solving cancer or climate change, whatever it is, feels like a kind of we need to be able to make all of that happen very, very quickly and as fast as possible. But on the kind of much broader general purpose models that are doing everything for everybody, there's questions about what does that look like in the future, and ensuring that the governance is able to make sure that that doesn't get out of control, while having a very, very positive side on finding a problem, using AI to solve it, having no issues about making that as something that can happen. But then when there's the big, because the thing that is the catastrophic stuff around national security and all of that that I worry about. That wasn't very eloquent, but maybe there's something there.
I will also try very briefly. I just will share with you my experience that I had in May, I believe, or June. I was invited to a special session on AI in finance at the OECD. And so we have these sectoral specific teams dealing with, and committees and working parties dealing with specific sectors. And I was totally encouraged by the way these people are approaching these issues. Insurance and assurance is part of that, of course, because if you look at it, it is actually the finance community that started to use the first models, including in insurance and assurance, investment, etc. So there we have the knowledge, which of course now needs to be tested in other contexts. But there are answers available now for decades in the finance industry, how you actually design and run a model that hopefully does not harm. Exactly.
There's a lot we can learn from that. Rachel Carson in the 1960s, talking about the impact of humans on the environment, located the problem in time. She said, in the modern world, there is no time. And that is also, I think, a theme that we've seen here. We can get the governance right. We really can as a globe, but we don't have that much time to do it, it seems. And that is the essence of a lot of the problems that we face. And it is also what we face right now in this seminar. There is no time. we're done. So please, let's thank the panelists. Thank you so much.